All right, let's jump right in. Today we're diving deep into a really powerful ancient letter, a message of hope that was sent to a church that was seriously suffering in a city called Smyrna. We're going to explore how some of the very first Christian thinkers made sense of this intense message about persecution and the incredible promise at the end of it all.
So right off the bat, the message hits you with this incredible line, "I know you're suffering in poverty, but you are rich." How on earth can a community that's going through so much hardship be called rich? That's the central mystery we're going to unpack today, looking over the shoulders of those who read these words centuries and centuries ago.
To really get this message, we've got to set the scene. So let's take a look at who's speaking, who they're speaking to, and what this city's name itself might tell us about the whole situation.
Okay, let's start with the name Smyrna. The ancient writer Bede pointed out that Smyrna sounds a whole lot like the word for myrrh, that fragrant resin they used in burials. For him, this was no coincidence. He saw it as a direct symbol for the mortification of the flesh, a powerful metaphor for the life and death persecution this church was actually living through.
So who's the one delivering this powerful message? He's identified as the first and the last who was dead and came to life. The commentator Oecumenius saw so much meaning packed into that title. The first points to divine ultimate authority, but the last points to a shared humanity. The point is, this isn't some distant God shouting from the clouds. No, this is someone who has actually experienced death firsthand and conquered it, offering a message of hope that's grounded in real experience.
Okay, so let's circle back to that central puzzle. How could this suffering community possibly be described as rich? Well, the early commentators had a very clear answer, and it had absolutely nothing to do with money.
And this chart just lays it out perfectly. Commentators like Andrew of Caesarea and Apringius basically saw it as a tale of two realities. In one column, yes, they were poor in the flesh. They were being beaten, their stuff was being taken, they were suffering constantly. But in the other column, they were rich in the spirit. They had the hidden treasure of faith, and even better, they had Christ as their wealthy patron. Their riches weren't material, they were eternal.
Now, the letter doesn't pull any punches when it comes to naming the source of their pain. It points to slander and persecution coming from a group it calls the Synagogue of Satan. I mean, that is some seriously strong language. And as you can imagine, the early interpreters had a few different ideas about who exactly this was referring to.
To get a handle on their interpretations, we first have to see how they were redefining words. Oecumenius, leaning on the Apostle Paul, argued that a true Jew wasn't about your ethnicity or external rituals. No, it was about being one inwardly. It was a spiritual thing, a matter of the heart, confessing Christ. And once you understand that redefinition, you can see how they started to think about their opponents.
So who was this group? Well, there was no easy consensus. Some thought it was pretty straightforward. Jewish communities who didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah. But others, like Tychonius, had a more shocking idea that it could actually mean false Christians inside the church, people who looked the part on the outside but had no real faith. And then others took an even bigger picture view, seeing it as any group in any time that sets itself against God, all ultimately led by the Antichrist.
Next, the letter offers this really startling prediction. The speaker warns the church that the devil is going to test them and that they will face tribulation for 10 days. Now, this obviously wasn't a literal forecast, so what did it symbolize?
The early commentators knew this number wasn't meant to be taken literally. They saw it as being packed with symbolic meaning, and they offered a couple of fascinating ways to unpack it. So the first interpretation, from a writer named Apringius of Beja, is all about perspective. He basically argued that 10 days was a symbol for a short, temporary period of suffering. His point was, when you compare any hardship on earth to an eternity of joy, it's going to feel brief, as fleeting as just 10 days.
Then you get this much more intricate take from a commentator named Promasius. He saw it as a kind of symbolic math. He started with the 7 days of the week, which represent the entire course of a human life. To that, he added the 3 great temptations that Christ himself faced in the desert. And what do you get? 7 plus 3 equals 10. So for Promasius, 10 days was like a code word for the sum total of all the spiritual trials a person will face in their entire life.
So after all this tribulation, what's the reward? What's the payoff? The letter's ultimate resolution is a promise of complete and total victory over death itself.
The promise is crystal clear. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. And the church father Cyprian really stressed that this incredible promise wasn't just for famous martyrs.
No, it was for every single person who remained steadfast, who stayed invincible in their faith right to the very end.
Now, to really understand this reward, you have to get their concept of two different kinds of death. The first death is physical, the separation of soul and body that, happens to everybody. But the second death was understood as something totally different, eternal punishment, the final consequence of sin. And the ultimate promise here is that the victor, the one who is faithful, will not be harmed by this second death.
So how do you get that kind of protection? Well, the theologian Fulgentius of Ruspe offered this really beautiful concept, the first resurrection. He argued that this isn't something that happens after you die, it's a spiritual transformation that happens now, in this life. It's that change from spiritual death to spiritual life through a conversion of the heart. And by participating in this first, spiritual resurrection, you're essentially protected from the power of that second eternal death.
And this brings us to our final thought, a powerful quote from Promasius that just ties this whole cosmic story together. He writes that the death Adam introduced to humanity by eating from a forbidden tree was ultimately conquered by Christ through the tree of the cross. It's just a stunning image of reversal and complete victory. It really leaves us with a question. How does reframing hardship, not as an end but as a path to a promised crown, change the way we see the trials we face today?